Okay, Rabbi Say, what is the deal with sherry cask? Is it mutter? Is it lechatchila, b'diavad, aser? How come I never heard of this shayla until 10, 15 years ago? You know, I've been drinking whiskey for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and I never heard of this until a couple of years ago. Where did this come from? Did somebody just make up a new chumrah? What is the story with sherry cask? So it goes like this. Let's just talk for a minute and understand what everything is. Now, there's something that we call whiskey. For some people, this is obvious. For me, it wasn't actually so obvious, to be honest. I'm sorry, I'm not the biggest drinker. But there's whiskey, which is hard alcohol, which comes in multiple forms. It can come in something called bourbon, which is what they make in America, primarily in Louisiana and Arkansas and places like that, and Tennessee. And then there's something called scotch. Scotch is a type of whiskey that they make in Scotland. And at the end of the day, most of the nice bottles that are at our Kadeshim, most of them are scotch. So that's going to be a very, very relevant conversation. And in some circles, they drink vodka, etc., whatever. But right now, most of our Kadeshim, I think, of the Haimish Oilam, the Yeshiva Oilam, most of the hard whiskey that we're going to see at these Kadeshim and at these Simchas are going to be scotch. So scotch is whiskey that is produced in Scotland, and it's actually one of the things in terms of kashrus which makes things very easy is they're very strict in requiring that it fits certain kolam. It can only have 5, 6 ingredients, whatever it is, oats and yeast and water and maybe a little caramel they're allowed in for color and 1 or 2 other things. But there's not many ingredients that go into scotch. So that is a breath of fresh air, and they are very makbid about this. Most of these scotch makers, a lot of these guys, they have Messiah from their Elta Zeta, and how to make scotch, and they've been doing it with these 5 ingredients for the last 200 years, and this is how they do it. Furthermore, there are very strict laws in Scotland that require that you're only allowed to put in these 5, 6 ingredients. It has to be aged at least 3 years, etc., etc. Most of them that we drink are aged much longer than that. So let's get started and understand the halachas of this scotch. But let's speak a little bit of history because it will be relevant to understanding the full picture. So here's how it goes. Once upon a time, for the last couple hundred years, they've been drinking, they need to put scotch into a barrel because we need to put scotch somewhere for it to age and ferment and mature and all these interesting words for 8, 10, 12, 18, 21, etc. years. So what do they put them in? They put them into barrels, generally made of oak wood or different types of wood. Now, how do they what barrels do they use? So historically, the way that it worked is that Spain was the main exporter of wine to Scotland, and actually on a much greater note to England, which is very close to Scotland. Scotland, they were primarily, you guessed it, scotch drinkers. They weren't such big wine drinkers. In England, they were very big wine drinkers, and they got most of their wine from Spain. So the way that it worked was that in Spain, they would ship full barrels of wine to England, and then in England they didn't make wine in England. It wasn't the right climate to make wine there. And then England, they would have all these empty barrels, and they would have nothing to do with it. So the people, the Chaver in Scotland, said, I have a great idea. We need barrels. You have barrels. You don't have what to do with it. We need barrels, and let's face it, more wine gets drank than scotch made, because you go through a bottle of wine a lot quicker than you go through a bottle of scotch. So there were tons of barrels of wine, and the people in Scotland said, why should I buy a new barrel or make a new barrel for $100 when I could just buy a used barrel of wine for $10. Based on supply and demand, there was a huge supply of these seemingly useless barrels. To go ship them back to Spain wasn't financially, economically, didn't make sense. And therefore, the Scotch makers in Scotland were able to buy these barrels at a very cheap price, because the people of England and I guess the whoever drank wine in Scotland had nothing to do with these barrels. So they were taking these wine barrels, these sherry casks, and they were using them for a couple hundred years. Why did they use them? The main reason they used them was they were cheap. There was some secondary reasons. Maybe it took away a little bit of the oak taste. Maybe it gave a little bit of a darkish, richer color to the scotch. But those were certainly secondary reasons. The primary reason that they were using these barrels was because they were cheap. Then, in 1975, the King of Spain, Fernando, whatever his name was, he died. And he was replaced by a democratic government. Now, when he was replaced with a democratic government, they passed new rules and new laws. One of their new rules was that out of Spain, we are only exporting bottled wine. No more barrels of wine, but only once they are already bottled. It was, I think it was just going to make more money for the country, and that was the decision. Now, what happened was they started shipping these wine bottles instead of barrels to England and Scotland and wherever else. What ended up happening was the people of the Scotch makers of Scotland said, we have a problem. We no longer have barrels to purchase to make our scotch in. So, maybe there was some sitting around for another year, 2 or 3 or whatever it was, but came, a year or two later, and there was no more barrels around. So there was now a barrel shortage for the Scotch whiskey makers, the Scotch makers. So it come, 1977 or so, they said, all right, we need a plan. So there was basically 2 plans that were made. Either some of them started making barrels themselves in Scotland, and they were making new, fresh barrels, or some of them were importing barrels of bourbon barrels from America. I'm not quite sure why it was more economically viable to import the bourbon barrels from America versus importing the empty wine barrels, sherry barrels from Spain, but that was the economical metzias of the time, and therefore that's what they were doing. Just derech agav, the barrels from America were only used for bourbon. The law in America, I don't know why they do this, I guess the chevra in Tennessee and Arkansas and Louisiana and all these places where they make bourbon, is you could only use a new cask for bourbon. And once again, bourbon's also very controlled, only a couple ingredients, it's all kosher. Except I'm not going to get involved. But Chumash Shavuot Pesach might be an issue sometimes. But outside of that, there's no kashrus be'etzim issues on bourbon, and therefore they were using these bourbon barrels. Very nice. Came along the late 80s, early 90s, because in the world of Scotch, it takes a long time for things to develop, because the people that actually know about Scotch and care about Scotch, so these guys, they drink, 10, 12, 18, 21, 24-year whiskeys. So what happened comes, let's say, early 90s, and they start drinking their whiskey, their 12-year Livet, their 12-year Macallan, their 12-year Fittage, whatever it was, and they're like, it doesn't taste good. It doesn't have the old taste. Maybe the chevra at the Kiddush Club, maybe they also know what's going on, and they started tasting, hey, Yankel, it's not right. So people started complaining to the Scotch makers in Scotland and saying this just doesn't taste like the old thing. It tastes woody. It tastes oaky. Where's there a smooth taste? And the Scotch makers now have to figure out what's going on. Why are we fielding all these complaints that our Scotch doesn't taste right? And they realize, you know what it is? It's that we have been using these oak wood casks, either new cask or bourbon cask, and we haven't been using the good old sherry cask. Actually, that sherry cask did something positive. There's going to be like 3 different girsas, and it's going to make a nafkamina. Either they said that they missed the flavor of the sherry. That might be more problematic, as you'll guess. Or they would say that they need the sherry to take away the oak woody taste. Not because they positively want the sherry, they just don't want the negative oak woody taste. If that's the case, you'll be a little bit better. Or something a little bit in the middle. They like the wine that's in the barrels causes the whiskey to oxidize or mature better, or whatever fancy chemistry terms they use, and therefore it creates whatever type of chemical reaction which is good for the whiskey. So it's not the pure taste of the wine, but it's the chemical effect of the wine. That might be somewhere in the middle. And therefore, the scotch makers said, okay, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going back to sherry. I mean, this is the early 90s. They haven't been using it for 12, 50 years. But it's time to start using the sherry cask again. So they quickly went, figured out what to do, and they started importing these sherry casks from Spain, or maybe a little bit France as well, different places. They started re-importing these sherry casks. And once again, they weren't able to import them filled with a barrel filled with wine, because that was still against the law, but they were able to import them empty, or they gave them a little wine for the journey, as they would say, to keep the taste fresh in the barrel, maybe. But let's put that aside for now. So now they imported these barrels because they specifically wanted that sherry taste, or they at least wanted the sherry cask, and they started making it again. Now keep in mind, if they're starting doing this in the early 90s, it's only gonna, the 12-year bottle, the 12-year Livet, Macallan, Fittich, whatever it might be, is only gonna hit the market when 2003, 2004, and that's when it starts hitting the market, these new sherry casks. And the way that things work, it usually takes people a year or two, the kashrus, whatever, to even chop or notice that there's a difference. And until there's a tumult, we were talking 2008. So that's why this sherry cask shayla is a relatively new shayla, because the mitzias was something that actually only relatively recently developed. Once again, it was something that they had historically, and we're going to discuss that in a minute. But there's a new shayla of them specifically and purposely wanting these sherry casks. And I want to point out the degree of desire that they have for them. Based on my simple Google search, I found that a sherry cask was 7 to 8 times the price of a brand new cask, a brand new barrel. I actually read somewhere online, I read somewhere on a sefer actually, that, by the way, somebody named, I think his name is Niehaus, or Akiva Niehaus. I actually found this the day of giving the shiur. I found out that he has a sefer. I saw a sefer online, 118 pages. I did not go through the whole sefer, but it looks like a masterpiece, and it looks like he did a lot of the research. So he says that it's 10 times the price, these sherry casks versus regular casks. And you see these on the high-end scotches, the scotch makers are going through the bother and going through the expense and going through the cost of paying 10 times as much to get their sherry casks. So you see something that they really, really want and they really, really value. I'm going to put on my financial hat for a second. If you could get a barrel for $100 and instead you pay $1,000 for that barrel, and think about something that you're not going to see your return for at least 12 years. So it has to be, you think there's a tremendous value add to do that on something that you're putting down money that you're not going to see a return for 12 years. I mean, obviously that's part of the industry of scotch. It's not the industry you go into for 2 years. But let's just think about that for a second. That's obviously very valuable for them. Okay, so now let's get started. Now we have some history. Let's open the halacha. Now we generally know most halachic kashrus issues involve bishul, heat. Usually taste is transferred via bishul. We are dealing over here with cold wine in a barrel. Then we're talking about cold scotch in a barrel. What is the problem? We know that they rinsed out the barrel from the wine before putting the scotch in. That seemingly is not the issue. So what's the issue here? So the issue is something called kivush, that the walls of the kli, of the barrel, absorb some of the wine. And actually wood, which is used for these barrels, are very porous and very absorbent. So they absorb this wine, and then they go and put the taste of the wine into the scotch. Perhaps. Let's understand. Now, some might want to jump up and say, wait a second. Surely we have a concept of noisein tam lipagam. When something is a tam that is in a kli, the blias, the tastes which are in a kli, after 24 hours, those tastes become stale and they become not important in the halacha. So why do I care about these tastes? And there's two answers for that. The first answer, which is the main answer, is that's true by most liquids. However, what do we know about wine? Wine's like a good yid. We get better with age. And therefore the taste of those blias actually are enhanced with age and they don't go off when it is wine. Number two is a davar charif rejuvenates the taste of even a pogum taste that is absorbed in the walls of a container, of a barrel, of whatever type of kli it is. Whiskey is presumably a davar charif, so even if it would be pogum, seemingly whiskey would have the ability of rejuvenating that taste. So that's why we cannot get away with the noisein tam lipagam, presumably. But we'll discuss that a little bit more detail soon. Okay, so we have this taste of wine in the walls. Okay, should that be a problem? Off the bat, I would say no. Maybe that taste is battul. So how much taste of one type of taste do you need to be battul in another type of taste? What's the normal ratio? So normally in halacha, we say that a taste is only battul in shishim. A little bit of milk falls into the big chalm pot, you're okay, because it's battul b'shishim. Now, is sherry cask battul b'shishim? Let's find out, let's think about it, let's see. Is it battul b'shishim? So, presumably not. But before we say this, I want to speak out of Gemara. Usually, by the way, we have a general rule that the walls of an item are almost never battul b'shishim in the contents of the item. But we'll see that its applicability in 1 minute. Now, there's a special rule by wine. It's based on the Gemara and Avodah Zarah that a wine is battul in shesh, not shishim, but in shesh. For those that aren't so good at math, that's a tremendous kula. Usually, you're only allowed up to shishim, 1.5% of something. But over here, you're allowed up to shesh, which is 16. You can have 16%. 70% is already a problem. 16% is okay. So if you have 16% wine poured into water, 16% stam yainim poured into water, that is okay. Oops, forgot to mention. What's the problem with this wine anyways? The problem is it's goyish wine, and therefore it's stam yainim, and stam yainim is going to be aser. We'll see, B'pashtus, maybe Sephardim might be Aser Ba'ana, Ashkenazim might just be Aser drinking, but because we're talking about Christians here, we're not talking about real Ovid Avodah Zarah. Derech Agav, I heard nowadays they have scotch that comes from Japan. I have no idea what the Metzias is. I didn't look into it, but I would be a little bit more scared about the blias if they use Japanese wine. I don't even know if the Japanese drink wine. I would maybe be a little bit more scared because over there, the mamash really have avodah zarah. Who knows what's going on over there? But in Spain and in England and in Scotland, there's not so much avodah zarah. There's Christianity, which is a whole discussion what it is. L'maisa, the Ramaz Mekel and the sugya of stam yainim for the most part about hana from the Christians. Okay. That was just a little sidebar. So we have this stam yainim absorbed into the walls of this barrel, but we know that wine into water is battul b'shesh. How about stam yainim into into kosher wine. So stam yain into kosher wine will need shishim for the very simple reason. The taste of wine is pagam, it messes up the taste of water. The taste of wine does not mess up the taste of wine. So wine into water, battul b'sheish, special chedesh. Wine into wine, you need shishim. What about shar mashkim? Would it be battul b'shishim into shar mashkim? So it's actually a Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch says, I'm actually going to jump to the Taz and the Shach because they have different ways of understanding the Shulchan Aruch. Maybe that's the easier way of doing this. That the Taz understands that rule, that wine is battul b'sheish, applies to shar mashkim. It applies to shar mashkim, and it's not only water; it's also all other things. It's beer, it's Coca-Cola, it's iced tea, it's orange juice, whatever it is. It is battul. Even shar mashkim, wine is battul b'sheish. Whereas the Shach understands that rule is specific to wine being battul in water. But in shar mashkim, you would need shishim of shar mashkim to be mevatel the taste of wine. Now, in svara, what should our whiskey be more comparable to? Wine or water? So in svara, the whiskey should be more comparable to wine. Why? Because wine messes up water. Wine enhances wine. Over here, the sherry cask tam, one way or the other, is enhancing the whiskey. And since it's enhancing the whiskey, presumably in svara, it should be more comparable to wine than it should, and require shishim, than to water and not require shishim. However, just because it's true that in svara the whiskey is more comparable to wine, doesn't mean that's going to be the halacha. One could probably argue that it fits into shar mashkim, and once there's shar mashkim is shar mashkim, and therefore I don't care in svara if it's more comparable to wine than water. It is one of the multiple subcategories of shar mashkim. Okay, so who do we pass like? Do we pass like the Taz, that you're allowed to be mevatel wine into sheish? Or do we pass like the Shach, that you need shishim to be mevatel the taste of wine in shar mashkim? We know that the general rule in Yeridea is when you have a machlokes, Taz and Shach, we generally go for the Shach. If we go for the Shach, we're going to have some problems there, because you're going to need shishim to be mevatel the wine. However, the interesting thing over here is that the Magen Avram, the Chachmas Adam, and the Pri Chadash hold like the Taz. So some of the very big hitters of the Paiskim, the Achronim, are for some reason following the Taz L'Kula. So we have, when you have a Magen Avram and a Chachmas Adam, that's nothing to sneeze about. And they are Mekel, and they are of the biggest Paiskim that are Mekel, that says wine could be battul in sheish. You could have 16% of wine in shar mashkim. But, L'maisa, the Shach is Machmir. Comes Rav Moshe, and by the way, people quote Rav Moshe as being an overall mater in sherry cask, and it's mostly narishkeit, because he's mater on one point, and that one point does not encompass the whole shayla of sherry cask, so it's a little bit of a misquote. But I'll show you what the heter of Rav Moshe is. Rav Moshe says that if you have in a sherry cask, I got to back up. I said that wrong. Rav Moshe says, they asked Rav Moshe Shayla, if you have whiskey, you have scotch, and you go and you they pour in some wine, is the wine battul b'sheish? And Rav Moshe paskined, yes. Rav Moshe said that you could drink that whiskey that had the wine poured into it. Now, once again, that's not what happens in Scotland. In Scotland, that is illegal. So if it was more than a theoretical question, it wasn't about scotch. Maybe in Ireland, they allow you to pour in a little bit, and some other places, I think up to 2.5% in Ireland, or American-made whatever, not bourbon, but American-made other types of whiskey. So up to 2.5%. So maybe that's what he was talking about. You poured in a little bit of wine, and he said it's okay. You could be seimech on the taz that wine is battul b'sheish. Heter Rav Moshe. However, Zafter Rav Moshe, a baal nefesh should be machmir not to drink it. And Rav Moshe goes on to say, I myself, Rav Moshe, do not drink this whiskey that would have wine poured into it. However, if somebody would at a simcha go and pour me a shot of such a whiskey, I wouldn't. I would drink it because it's mechse kiyura. And similarly, he didn't want to embarrass the host, the Baal Simcha. The Rosh Yeshiva, could the Rosh Yeshiva have a make l'chaim? So he would make a l'chaim. Stam, you see the midas of Rav Moshe Feinstein as well over here. But he held me'ikar adin, it's not a good thing. But I should present it the opposite way. I'm sorry. Me'ikar adin, he held that it's mutter, and we can be seimech on the taz. But he said it's a baal nefesh should be machmer, and he was machmer except when it came to a Mexican Euro public embarrassing type situation. Then he was mekel. Okay, that was the shayla of the taz, and we're gonna be seimech on that taz. Once again, baal nefesh machmer, that we could say it could be battul b'sheish. Okay, now how much? Once again, we're not pouring wine. That was the shayla of Moshe was pouring wine. We're discussing pouring wine. We're discussing housing the whiskey in a sherry cask, a wine barrel. What should be worse, pouring whiskey in or putting it in a wine barrel? So off the bat, you would probably think pouring wine in, would be worse. That's what you would assume. Pouring wine in is worse. However, here's the interesting thing. The wine that they were pouring in was a very small percentage. How much of the barrel do we taste from the barrel, do we assume to have gone into the whiskey? So once again, that's a different machlokes Shach v'taz. And by the way, this is Rav Moshe Feinstein didn't say anything about the Shach and taz. There's a general rule, when we're dealing with bishul properly, we always take into account the full thickness of the barrel, or the full thickness of the pot, I should say, is what you're usually cooking in. Now, when it comes to something that wasn't cooked, but there was only kivush, there was soaking, the wine soaked in the barrel, and now we're soaking the whiskey in that barrel, how much of the taste from that wine taste goes into the whiskey? So the fi the taz, only kadei klipa, the thinnest, most layer of the barrel, thinnest inner shell of the barrel, so it's like a little bit that you would scrape off, so to speak, and that a little bit that you would scrape off would certainly be battul in sheish of the contents of the barrel, maybe even battul b'shishim of the contents of the barrel. That'd be great. However, the Shach says we view the full thickness of the barrel. We view the full thickness of the container, and you need the contents to be mevatel the full thickness of the container. Okay. Now, this Rabbi Akiva Niehaus, I think his name is, from Chicago, he was nice enough to work out the mathematical cheshbonis, and apparently the barrels, but if you ever see a barrel, an American barrel is this thick, and apparently a European barrel is like this thick. So they're very, very thick. And they're making them mostly in European barrels, right? From Spain and France. So apparently the mass of the barrel is around 25% the size of the volume of wine, of whiskey that it holds. Once again, the size of the barrel is around 25% the thickness of the contents of the wine. So 25% is not battul b'sheish. So interestingly enough, if we're going to view the full thickness of the barrel, the full thickness of the barrel is not battul b'sheish. Now you might come and say, come on, like the full thickness of the barrel, there's no way that there's going to be that much wine in the walls coming into the scotch. Well, apparently if you cut open a sherry cask barrel, you very often see that it's almost all the way through the barrel. And once again, they're very porous wine. So sometimes it's almost all the way through the barrel that it's red, stained from the wine. Sometimes you even get the outside of the barrel ends up stained from wine because the wine seeps through the barrel. So, Halacha, we're saying, so it's very mistaber, like the Shach here. So once again, there's a machlokes Shach v'taz, who we generally pass like the Shach. Svar over here is also pointing towards the Shach, because that's how the Metzias seems to be. So the Maisa, what do the Poskim say? So who do we pass like? So almost all the Poskim go with the Shach, that you need the full thickness of the Kli, and therefore the full thickness of the Kli is not going to be battul in the contents of the whiskey. There is a couple of names that most of us have never heard of, and one big name that paskins like the Taz. And that one big name is the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish paskins like the Taz. He says the Psak is like the Taz, that you only view the innermost klipa. That's all you need to be battul, is the innermost klipa. You don't need more than the innermost klipa. But according to the other poskim, you need the full thickness of the kli, which, based on the Metzias, you do not have. I don't think many people were aware of this Metzias before there were recent calculations, because, once again, the place in Eretz Yisrael, I'm not saying, it just wasn't so around. And, they don't have many wine barrels. Actually, I guess they do have wine barrels. They make a lot of wine in Israel. I don't know, maybe I take that back. But I think people didn't know this Metzias so much. But, I don't know. Okay. So, as I was saying, one derech teheter now would be, if you hold like the Taz, that wine is battul b'sheish. Okay, that's a reasonable idea. Bal nefesh should be machmir not to, but that's a reasonable idea to hold like the Taz, that it's battul b'sheish. Plus, you hold like the Chazon Ish, which Rav Moshe never spoke about, that we only view the width of the innermost klipa when it comes to bittul. Then combining those two shitas, you could reach a heter for the regular, maker din nam bal nefesh to drink whiskey that's made with a sherry cask. So we found our first derech laheter, but this derech laheter, as you hear, is not so geschmack, because it's not so geschmack if you need to rely on that Taz and this Taz, this Rav Moshe and that Chazon Ish to get to your matzif of heter. Okay, so that is that. Now, next. You might be asking yourself, and this this is a reasonable question. Surely if they're doing it, and they're doing it for the taste, surely that you should not be able to mevatel a taste that they're lechatchila doing for this. So let's just break this down into three different components. The first component is something that's affecting the taste is often not battul. Over here, since it's d'Rabbanan, and B is something called a zevzeh goyim, meaning it's not that you're tasting the taste of wine, but pashtus in the whiskey. It's that the taste of wine with the taste of whatever oats, with the taste of whatever wood, with the taste of whatever this, that, and the other, and 16 other things go together and combine to make a new taste. That is something that you're tasting. You're not tasting the wine. If you were actually really tasting the wine, mamish, and it tasted like wine, that would be a problem. But it doesn't really, the whiskey doesn't taste like wine. The wine enhances the taste. It combines with many other factors. It's a zevzeh goyim on a d'Rabbanan, and you can be mekel. I'm not saying there isn't anybody that's machmir, but I'm saying the pashtus says you can be mekel on that shayla. The next shayla is a very similar question, where something that's there for color purposes, it colors the item. Usually you cannot be mevatel something that provides color. And we're going to give the same answer, that it's d'Rabbanan and it's zevzeh goyim. The color is not only coming from the sherry cask, etc., and therefore you could be mekel on that shayla. There's another question of that you're not allowed to be mevatel isur l'chatchila. And I would say it might be a problem if a yid wanted to use a non-kosher sherry cask to make his own whiskey. But it's a guy who's being mevatel this or lechatchila. And yes, there are Jewish people drinking, but we're a very small minority of the whiskey drinkers of the world, and therefore, as D'Rabbanan, etc., and therefore will be mekel on mevatel iser lechatchila. Okay, what else are our shaylas? So far we have that one derech laheter. There is another potential derech laheter. What is the other potential derech laheter? So the other potential... before I want to point out one thing before I do the other derech laheter. If you have something called a multi-cask whiskey, when I say multi-cask, it sometimes will say on the bottle, a third, part sherry cask, part new cask, part bourbon cask, or two of them, whatever it is. Then you're going to have bittul b'sheish. Why? Because anyways, we said that, it's almost there. It's, 1 in 4, the whatever's in the sherry cask, the barrel compared to the contents. And now if you're what they do by a multi-cask is it's not that the contents go to this cask, then go to that cask, then go to the other cask. When it says multi-cask, what it is a third came from whiskey in this cask, a third came from whiskey in this cask, and a third came from whiskey in that cask. And if that's the case, then it's surely going to be bittul b'sheish. And no, we do not say chanan, chaticha nasis nevela. We are not going to say that now the full sherry cask is 100% a problem, because it's d'Rabbanan, it's not basar b'cholov, and it is lach b'lach, whereas it's not a chaticha nasis nevela. So for various heterim, as I just explained in Bekitzer, if you know what I'm talking about, great. We do not have the issue of chaticha nasis nevela chanan. Okay, so therefore, if you're going to have multi-cask, we're going to be mekel, it's going to be battul. Okay, weiter. Now, there is another potential heter when it comes to sherry cask. And what is that? What is that heter? We have a Shulchan Aruch Yordei Kof Lamed Zayin Sif Daled, which tells us that it seems to be a heter. This is actually the heter that Shlomo Miller, one of the leading poskim of North America, maybe the leading poskim, one of the leading poskim of North America, has to say, and he's definitely a big hitter, and he says, based on this, from what I heard, based on this Shulchan Aruch, that we can be mater. And when you hear this, it's going to sound pretty compelling. Kaleb hasur machmas yayin shel goyim motor litem l'tzeichai bein mayim bein shecher bein shar mashkin ubavad shiyudiach betchila l'chluchei yayin shal pnei kaleb v'chein motor l'mlikmem. Pretty seems like what were we doing the last half an hour? It seems like we have a first Shulchan Aruch that says that as long as you wash out the container, which they do, you're allowed to take these kalim, which had the wine of the guy. You're allowed to put shar mashkim in there. So ma baya, what's the problem? So there's no way that I was talking for 35 minutes without just to get knocked out by the Shulchan Aruch. So the thing is, if it was only the Shulchan Aruch, then that's obvious. But the problem is, there's another Shulchan Aruch in Kof Chaf Gimel, Yordei Kof Chaf Gimel, Siman Yud Gimel. Charisin shabelu yayin shel goyin harbe ad shekeshayin oisai b'mayim poltel yayin asur barna. There's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that says that when the Goyish soldiers used to go out to war, they would soak their barrels, their charisin, cheres containers in wine. Cheres are very absorbent. They would soak it in wine. They would break off a piece of the barrel and they would take it with them. And when they would have some time to rest, they would put the cheres into water. the taste of wine would go out of the chayris into the water, and now they would have a cup of wine or wine tasting water at least for their relaxing at night by the war. Now that the Shulchan Aruch paskins the charisin is aser behana. Wait, what's going on? Is the barrel mutter to use or aser to use? Stira. What's going on? It seems like there's a stira in the Shulchan Aruch. On one hand, what we just did earlier was a Kuf Lamed Zayin. We said that it's mutter to use, but a Kuf Gimel it says it's also to use the Goyish barrel. What's the difference? So many want to answer and explain. The difference is the kavana. If the barrel was only used stam, it was just the container. We weren't trying to get the taste of the wine into the container, but it was just about the container. Then that is okay to drink shar mashkim from such a container. However, if they dafka wanted the taste of the wine to go into the barrel, then it is a problem. That barrel, according to the Shulchan Aruch, would be aseh ba'ana. What is the story with our sherry cask? Is it more comparable to the stam container, or is it more comparable to the charisin, which were specifically infused? So I think we could say, from the Metzias, it's quite obvious that nowadays it's more comparable to the charisin. Why? Because these whiskey makers, these scotch makers are super concerned. They want that taste in the walls of the sherry cask. They have all these mahalchim of how they do it. They even char it in, and they have all these different processes I don't really understand to make sure that the taste stays in the walls, and they want it to be first fill right after you empty out the sherry cask. They want to right away use it for scotch. When they send the sherry cask on the boats, the empty barrels on the boats over to Scotland, they usually put a little wine in there, and to keep the fresh taste of the wine in the walls of the barrel. They want that taste there. You're right, they're not allowed to sell the wine in the barrel, so it's spilled out. It's not for commercial sale. But they put some wine in there just for that flavor. They want it. They're spending 10 times the amount on those barrels because they want the taste in the walls. McAllen, they have some guy, the master woodsman, who they sent to Spain to go and pick out wood for the barrels, and they make their own barrels in Spain, and then they lease it out to their choice winemaker because they want the right wine to be used for 4 years with those barrels, and then after those 4 years they ship it back to Scotland, or it's not back actually, for the first time to Scotland, and then they use it for their whiskey. They're very, very pedantic, and they're very makpid that the taste of wine be in those barrels. So seemingly it is bepashtus much more similar to the case of charisin, which those barrels are usher to use, than to the barrels which were just stam had wine in them. Is there any tzad for those mekilim? I don't know what Rav Shlomo Miller says, but I'm going to assume some of the tainas that I heard, which may be the tainas of Rav Shlomo Miller, I'm not sure, but I think they are. You might argue that you could rely, and by the way, before I go right, Rav Shlomo Miller is makel with this, and his kashrus organization, the COR, is makel. Most of the kashrus organizations, the high majority of the poskim and kashrus organizations are machmir, not like, and assume that our wine of today is like the charisim. Now, let's understand why. So, maybe Rav Shlomo Miller is going to claim, first of all, if it's true that the purpose of the wine is just to keep away the oak woody taste, but it's not actually positively contributing taste, then there's much more to be makel on, because you say it's not, we don't dafka want that taste. The problem is that when you actually ask the scotch makers, most of them will tell you that they dafka want the taste of the wine, of the sherry. Also to note is that it's true that the average Yankel doesn't know the difference, whether there's sherry or not, there isn't sherry. The connoisseurs, the fine drinkers, maybe you know that guy at the Kiddush Club who, we're not going to talk about him, you know what I'm saying? He knows the difference. The most of us don't. We just fake it, you know? Oh, what is this, 8 year? Oh, it's horrible. The 18 year? Geschmack. So, that's me, that's you, we fake it, you know what I mean? But there's that one guy at shul that he knows the difference. There is a difference, even though I have no idea. But there is a difference. Number 2. Some people will want to claim that it's a gimmick. This whole sherry cask thing, it's not real. It's not all. They just are doing it because it's a marketing pitch, it's a marketing tool, it's a gimmick. But the whole sherry cask thing, it doesn't really change anything. It's just shtuyo. I find that hard to believe for multiple reasons. One reason that I find that hard to believe is, first of all, they're spending 10 times as much on these barrels. It's an industry that's hundreds of millions of dollars are invested into this industry of sherry cask. You're going to tell me it's just a marketing gimmick? I find it difficult to believe. Second of all, just if you remember the history lesson, when they stopped using the sherry cask, all these scotch connoisseurs started having a heart attack. The Kiddush couldn't go on. What's going on? Kiddush Club will never be the same again. So there were definitely people that were able to tell a difference. So I find it unlikely to say it's just a marketing gimmick. I agree most people can't tell, but that doesn't change that there's a metzias going on, there's a chashivas to the process, and there's a kavana of wanting that taste. So b'pashtus, it's going to be difficult to rely on that heter. But once again, we have 2 possible ways to heter. One possible way is combining the taz with the other taz, the taz of battul b'shish, which is the Rav Moshe, with the taz of only factoring kadei klipa of the chazon ish. That's one option. The other option that we have is that we could rely on the svara, we'll call it the Rav Shlomo Miller svara, of that it's just like any kli that was used for wine. It's not really a problem. Whereas we're not viewing it as specifically b'kavana infused because it's not so chashiv. You don't really taste the tam. I don't actually want to call it the Rav Shlomo Miller svara. I want to back up from that because I didn't hear him say that svara, so I'm backing up from that. I want to rename that a svara based on this Shulchan Aruch. Okay. Not pashut. Now, let's just understand a little bit about how we end up over here, because really from what I'm saying, we have 3 categories of scotch. We have the scotch that's made purely new cask, purely bourbon cask, and I'm telling you, even though there's no hashkach on it, we know there was only 5-6 ingredients, which are all good. Beautiful. Enjoy l'chaim. L'chaim toiv l'shalom. Beautiful. We have a next category, which is the other extreme. Something 100% sherry cask. As I explained, there are coolers out there, not pashut. Then there's something else which we call multi-cask. Multi-cask is something where a third of it was made in a sherry cask, let's say a third in this cask and a third in the other cask. For that you could be mekel. And by the way, I just want to point out, usually the amount that's for a sherry cask is usually very minimal. It's usually only 10 or 20% in the sherry cask and 80% in other casks. And the reason? Sherry casks are much more expensive. They're not going to use more sherry casks than they need to. So that is going to be, you'll be able to apply the battul b'shesh. There will still be the Baal Nefesh Yachmer of Rav Moshe, but Me'ikar Din, we're going to say that is fine. So we're going to say the multi-cask is fine, but a Baal Nefesh should probably be Machmer. However, there's something which is, don't get confused, something that's different than a sherry cask, which is something that's called, what they call it, a finished it in sherry cask. If it uses the terminology in the label that it was finished in sherry cask, that means that it was all, it started off in bourbon or a new cask. And then, for the last 3 months or the last 6 months, because it's not nearly as expensive for it to be there 3 months or 6 months than it is to be in there for 12 years. So for the last 3 months or 6 months or whatever it was completely put into a sherry cask. That is a problem. That would, because the entire contents were put in the sherry cask, and you will not have the bittul b'sheish. And it doesn't always use the term finished. Sometimes it uses the term seasoned in sherry cask, or exclusively matured, or Madeira matured, or Madeira finished, or double matured in sherry cask. Any of these type of terminologies means that it was completely in the sherry cask, and that is like a pure sherry cask, which, as I said, the pashtus is we should be machmer. Listen, if somebody wants to rely on Shlomo Miller, they could. He's very big shoulders, so there is what to rely on. I'm not here to say there's nothing to rely on, but it's definitely not pashut, and most of the poskim are not happy with it. I'm not so comfortable with it. Okay, not that I'm on a level to put myself anywhere near any of the aforementioned people, but I'm just saying the right poskim are not happy, but there is what to be samech. Also to note that it doesn't always use the term of sherry. There are other terms that they have for wine as well. One term that you sometimes see is port. Port is actually a very strong wine. It's a type of wine that's actually very strong, and that is also a problem. Or obviously sherry, we mentioned. French cask. What is French cask? It means French wine cask. That's going to be a problem. It could use the term Saturday or Olorosa or Madeira or Pedro something or another, Zemex or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. But when it uses any of these terms, there are multiple terms for wine. So once again, keep your eyes out. If it says on it, port, sherry, French cask, obviously wine, Satorme, Olorosa, Madeira, Pedro something or another, I don't know what it is. Those are names you have to watch out for. Those are going to be potential problems. Now, to point out, just so you know, it sounds like I was being pretty machmer over there. I want to point out, pure sherry cask is rare. I'm not saying it doesn't exist; it exists. But it's only going to be very expensive bottles, and etc., etc. The high majority of the bottles are going to be no sherry cask or multi-cask. So you're usually going to be okay. Now a lot of them also, this is something called single malt and something called what is it called, a mixed malt? I don't know. I can't remember the name anymore. But something like Johnny Walker, for example, there's like 50, 60 different things that could be going into these big mixes, certain whiskeys that are malts and lots of things. I mean, I know I'm missing the term. I apologize. That have lots of different whiskeys mixed into them, and that's how they make it. So those things are generally going to be fine. It's very rare for those to have enough sherry cask that's going to be battul b'sheish. It's very often going to be battul b'shishim. So there's lists out there that you can find online that's going to tell you what's what, or you can read the label. Now we helped out reading the label. The label's usually pretty good. It's very unlikely that it has sherry and they didn't put it on the label, because if they spent the money for the sherry, they'll probably put it on the label. It just doesn't make financial sense to do otherwise. And wishing the olam l'chaim. And l'maisa, there's a lot that we could still drink. I didn't make this so great, but I just want to point out that this is not something that they made up in the last 15 years. Something that I just want to be clear in concluding. Pre-1975, when they were just using these barrels because they were cheap, then it's very simple to rely on that Shulchan Aruch that said you could reuse the barrel for something else, because that's all that was going on. It was a wine barrel that was reused for something else. but now it's a totally different world. It's a totally different metzias. They are infusing the walls specifically with wine, and in this new metzias, we have the other Shulchan Aruch, and that's why the metzias has changed, and therefore that's why the poskim of 30, 40 years ago have no problem, but nowadays we're in a different world with a different shayla, and all those people that want to say, oh, Rav Moshe was mater shari cask. Rav Moshe never even was faced with the shayla that we have nowadays, and therefore it's kind of ridiculous to claim that it was Rav Moshe. I mean, you could be relying on a combination of Rav Moshe and the Chazon Ish that is one mahalach, and maybe that's what some people mean. Probably not. Either way, there's a lot you could drink. L'chaim tovim u'lishalom.